In June 1974, Margaret Birch, the Provincial Secretary of Social Development, delivered to the legislature a proposal to change Ontario's licensing requirements for daycare, designed, in their words, to develop and operate less expensive daycare services. The entire daycare community across Ontario rose up in opposition. People thought that the policy would result in much reduced quality in daycare centres across the province. Julie Mathian and Susan Caldwell, members of the Daycare Reform Action Alliance at the time, described the policy problem, the campaign, and the aftermath. Hello, my name is Sue Colley, and I'm with Rise Up Feminist Digital Archive, and today I'm interviewing Julie Mathian and Susan Caldwell about their experiences in a moment in the history of the women's movement that we are describing today. And that moment is the campaign against the Birch proposals. And that was a struggle that began as long ago as June 1974, when Margaret Birch, who was the Provincial Secretary for Social Development Ontario, made sweeping proposals to lower the quality of care, daycare as we called it then, in Ontario under the guise of making it much cheaper. And so maybe, Julie, you could start by telling us exactly what these Birch proposals were and sort of where they came from.
Well, they came from an interesting place. Sort of, there's a dotted line connection. Susan, I don't know if you remember, but in the spring of '74, Daycare Organizing Committee, which Susan and I both worked for, had been organizing childcare in Toronto for the last couple of years. Susan worked on it before I did. I joined Daycare Organizing Committee when I left Campus Community Cooperative. Yeah. And we had been advocating for more and better childcare, and also a lot of parent choice. Childcare centers at the time were, many of them were quite institutional in that parents didn't have a lot to say about what went on in their child's day, and the co-op childcare, as opposed to the co-op nursery school movement, was really very much grounded in parent participation, parent choice of childcare, not parent choice for anything. So that had been part of our advocacy, is parents need to be involved. And we had a meeting. We had a meeting where it was a seminar, a Saturday morning seminar. So we invited a whole lot of people who are interested in childcare. So it would have been people working in social welfare, people working in co-ops now, parents and staff, and people who were also in other organizations. I'm sort of speculating here, but I think people like Barbara Cameron were probably there, and Betty Bircher and people like that. And we had, and somebody from the provincial government came, some policy analyst from the provincial government came. And I can remember him saying, because we've been advocating for, they sort of took it the wrong way, for more flexibility in childcare, this policy analyst said, oh, and we have an announcement that's going to come out in the next 6 weeks or so that we think is going to make you very happy.
Oh, I see. So that was the first clue you had, eh?
Thought, okay, this should be interesting. All right. Okay, right. So then we went off. Tom and I went off to England for a trip, and I was in Canada House about 2 days before we were supposed to come back. Read the Globe and Mail. The announcement was there, and I read it and went, uh-oh. It's going to be really busy when I get back, I can tell. And by the time I got back, Susan had already rolled up her sleeves and started organizing the connections that we developed through Daycare Organizing Committee, which had been set up by Campus Community Cooperative.
Okay, so what were these proposals that you read in the Globe and Mail?
Okay, so the proposals were reductions in the requirement for staff-child ratios and group sizes, reductions in
that means like fewer staff to more children.
Fewer staff to more kids. So I think it was for infants. I think it went from 1 to 3 to 1 to 6.
Oh yeah.
So some of it was really hugely problematic. And then some changes in requirements for physical things, and also to make it easier to cater in food. So the requirement for a kitchen was proposed as well. I think that people's main concern was the group sizes and staff-child ratios, as I recall. And so the policy analyst who told us ahead of time that this was coming down the pipe and he thought we'd like it really did literally disappear from view. We never ever saw him or heard from him ever again.
I wonder why. That's interesting.
Right.
So Susan, what were you rolling up your sleeves and doing at this time while Julie was still in Canada House in London?
Well, you've got to realize that. Let me back up just a second to say the way I got involved with this whole thing was getting involved with the infant daycare center at the University of Toronto that was called Sussex, okay? And it was Sussex Daycare Center. And so you have been involved, if you had your child there, you did both male and female, all parents did their shifts there. So do you remember the local initiative program that came out in the 1972?
It was 2. Yeah, it was 2.
Uh-huh. Well, essentially, they wrote up a project, and it was Jackie Larkin and myself who were hired to do daycare organizing committee. So Julie came after. Jackie went on and did something else, but Julie came after. So I was already involved in the cooperative movement there. And by this time, we had also had Sussex was an infant daycare center. There was Devonshire, which was over 2. And we had taken over the building because the University of Toronto would not grant us any space. So that when she says I'm rolling up my sleeves, I was involved as a parent, but also as an organizer in one of the most active cooperative daycare centers that was happening, and with a lot of activists in it. So it is very much not just meeting other people, it's taking your own people and standing up and starting to do stuff. Does that make sense?
These proposals were announced, as you described them, Julie. And so what was the first reaction? What did you, and the Daycare Organizing Committee was one of the bodies organizing around this. What exactly did you do? Can you tell us about the campaign and what the steps were and what was involved in the process?
Sure. Who should go first?
You.
Whoever.
You go.
As I said, when I got there, Susan had already made a whole bunch of contacts, both at Campus Community Cooperative, which was also Sussex and Devonshire, and also we had other people who, because of the especially the cooperative childcare centers, which were new and few at that point, had made contacts with each other. So we had contacts there. There were places like Northwest Communicare in Hamilton. There was St. Andrews, who we'd got to know through the fight with U of T over the space. There was a place called Snowflake on McCall Street. There was a daycare in the West End Y by that point. So there were a whole bunch of community-based either co-ops or just plain nonprofits. And then there was good old Grace Carmen United Church. Do you remember, Susan, you remember Grace Carmen? That was the one daycare that we tried to start up that led a brief and difficult life. Yeah, right. And so there were people in there who were, I would call them activists at that point. I mean, the co-op or nonprofit childcare movement at that point was fairly political. And there were people, I'm trying to think, like Pat, for example, Schultz was involved because she'd been involved in the sit-in in Devonshire. So there were, we had people, and people like the feminist organizations who had become interested in childcare. As you know, there were some very good papers written at the time. And so the first thing we did, so this is, we're talking June here, and by this time we were talking, I'd say probably mid-June by the time we got back from England. And stuff was already starting on the ground. But do you remember we planned a big meeting at Oisey, at the auditorium at Oisey? And so we managed to get someone to finagle us some free space using the auditorium for free. And I can remember, we were good. We knew how to organize speakers. We knew how to, talk to the media. We knew that sort of stuff. So we did all that kind of work. We had buckets available to pass around so people could put in contributions because we were going to need money. Susan and I actually operated as sort of paid staff until our funding got cut off and Susan moved. So I remember that night because people started streaming into Oisey, and we had only asked for half of the auditorium because there was a big foldable wooden divide that they could divide the place in half. And so we had only asked for the front half. I mean, how many people were we going to get? Really. And I can remember walking up the aisle with Pat Redican just to sort of see what was going on. And we realized that there were people sitting behind that barrier, behind the barrier that cut off the auditorium in half. And we went, whoa. So we managed to.
How many people do you think the auditorium holds?
Pardon?
How many people do you think the auditorium holds?
Couple of hundred.
Yeah, and then so half of it would be about 100, right?
Yeah. So we thought 100, that should do it. And so so we managed to browbeat basically a security guard into pulling that divide aside. He said, "You only asked for half." I said, "We need the whole thing." And we filled the auditorium that night. It was absolutely amazing. And so then we had to big time. And fortunately, we had people sign in, and so we had contact information and stuff like that. But it was I remember being really surprised at the amount of interest that this generated within the childcare community, and we even had people who were there from nursery schools and stuff as well. So it was pretty, yeah.
That's great. So then you obviously wrote briefs. You had pamphlets. Did you actually contact the ministry at that time to raise the problems with the proposals? Do you remember any of that, Susan? Or
no, I was going to come back to the thing of that. What the opposition to the proposals didn't come from just the cooperative movement. The people who in the real daycare, already the funded daycare centers, the provincial funded daycare centers, they really thought this was a bad idea. So we weren't just calling upon, our political buddies and all this sort of stuff. It was a widespread recognition that this was going to really hurt the quality of daycare. You were turning daycare into something else. It wasn't about being good for the kids. It wasn't about being positive. It was just about keeping them quiet during the day or something, or taking care of them. And that was a really important thing of when we linked with and got supported by the already existing daycare centers, not just the cooperative ones that we were trying to establish and that we worked with. I just want to raise that. It wasn't just us. It was a much broader, almost everyone who was, even some of the private daycare centers that we happen to know for a variety of reasons. Yes, they might have saved a little money, but they knew it wouldn't be a good daycare for their kids. They were willing to pay what pay the staff what it should be doing. So that ratio, especially the issue of the ratio, was one of the very critical parts of everyone recognizing you're treating this as if it's just a organizational problem, not that there are real human children involved who need education, who need the social support, who need all that. That had become a much broader support for this movement.
That's an incredibly important point, because with us within a second almost, we had a broad-based movement. And the other thing that was at work here is that we knew that for the last, I don't know, year, Mini-Skools, which was the big American chain that was starting to roll out in the States, was also looking at Canada and looking at Ontario specifically, because it was the province with the most people and the most childcare, because of the wartime day nurseries partly, and it had more of a history than the other provinces, and it had the first regulation, and so they were looking for somewhere where they could make money, and they actually had already established. Well, that September they opened up their first Mini-Skools. So it didn't, you didn't have to be a genius to figure out what was going on here. And so,
okay, so what was going on then?
Well, it was reasonably clear, and they even Mini-Skools even semi-admitted it, that they've been lobbying the provincial government for especially changes in the group sizes and staff-child ratios, because that's 80 to 90% of your budget, and if you're going to make any savings, that's where you're going to make the savings.
So basically, Margaret Birch had couched these changes to the regulatory requirements, including staff-child ratios, as one where this would be a wonderful thing for the province, because working mothers would be able to, and I think mothers was,
yes, right.
The notion,
right.
Working mothers would be able to go and leave their children at a reduced cost, because of course, if you have less staff to more children, you could reduce the costs. And this was also beginning to be a problem in Toronto. Is that right?
What was beginning to be a problem in Toronto?
The cost.
Oh,
Yeah.
Well, the other thing is that the working women and their childcare arrangements, which the federal government a study of federal government had done a couple of years previously. Not only was cost a problem, then we still weren't at the point where people had got used to paying for childcare. The number of, in that study, which was the first one that was ever done, the number of women who actually, or number of families who actually used licensed childcare was minuscule, as I recall. And the vast majority of children where in this point, the working woman was working outside the home, and children were being looked after during the day. Most children were being looked after by other family members, most in their own home, and most weren't paying anything for it. So there was so not only was there a practical affordability problem, which there's always been, there was at that point a cultural problem as well. So and childcare still at that point, Susan, you will probably remember as well, group childcare, especially for infants and toddlers, was highly suspect. I remember being on panels and more than once somebody standing up from the audience and telling me that my children would be setting the cat on fire by the time they were 3, because they were going to be emotionally deprived because they'd been in childcare. Part of what the movement did was be able to work away at that over time. So,
okay, so basically these were the proposals, and there was, so then how do you think that the organizations came together you started talking about the OISE forum, and so who was involved in organizing that? Was there a leadership within the campaign? Was it the Daycare Organizing Committee, or was it the Daycare Reform Alliance, or was it the Community Development Committee of Metropolitan Toronto, or how did the players, what players were involved and how did they operate during this period?
So I can start and then Susan can follow up. So initially it was Daycare Organizing Committee and people we knew.
Yeah.
That was those are the people who organized that OISE meeting. So it would have been people like Pat and other people from West End Y, and Elodie Schultz was involved from St. Andrews, and basically and Kathy Gallagher Ross worked at Grace Carmen. That was how she originally became involved in childcare. And so it was a bunch of activists getting involved and setting up the meeting. After that, it was the meeting. I'm really, this is a bit tentative, but as I recall, what we did was we developed a kind of I don't want to call it. Everything was very consensual. I mean, it wasn't a very I'm losing my words. Anyway, it wasn't hierarchical, let me put it that way. But there was an organizing committee that was set up out of that. And I can remember some of the people involved, and also so the Daycare Organizing Committee sort of became the secretariat for that.
Okay.
So that's what happened, and then after that, that actual steering committee, I guess I'd call it, organized other meetings throughout the summer.
Right.
So we had 2 or 3 others throughout the summer that were very well attended. We used to use, instead of OISE, we used to use the auditorium at the Faculty of Education, which was then the Faculty of Education at Bloor and Spadina, across the street. So we used that. There were some ancillary projects that went on as well. So we had we were getting, after that big meeting at OISE, we were getting 100 people at the smaller meetings. We probably had 3 or 4 of those before the demonstration in October. Susan is correct when she talks about the breadth of the organizations. I mean, we had, who were conspicuously absent were Mini-Skools, obviously, and a lot of the for-profit sector. I mean, there were some actual, there were some places in Toronto where almost everything was for profit, and that would have been Scarborough, for example. They would have been a lot of mom and pops. They didn't like this one bit, but there were a couple of other, Susan's right, there were a few private childcare centers that weren't ever making a profit anyway. I mean, and some of them were very good, but they acted more like nonprofits than they did like for-profit centers. And Ermengarde Hoff, I remember, and then there was a woman named Veronica Roynan, who kind of stuck by. And then the municipal centers were critical. We had people from the colleges. Nick Laidlaw from the Institute of Child Study. Do you remember Nick with his ear horn? He had an ear trumpet. And then the old line nonprofits like Victoria, Cradleship Creche, the Ontario Welfare Committee, Social Planning Council. In all of those organizations became a part of this. Labor. The federations, the teachers' federations came along later, as I recall, and labor at that point wasn't involved.
Right. But did all these people form the Daycare Daycare Reform Action Alliance? Or was that different? Yeah. That's what they became?
Yeah.
And that's what proceeded to lead the campaign against the Birch proposals? Yeah. Right. Yeah. Fabulous. So what did they say? I mean...
Yeah. Susan's trying to say something.
Well, sorry.
I think that the issue of that, this was in the context of the women's movement. And so the right of women to take jobs, but also to have childcare was really a widespread thing. And sure, I mean, that's why the Mini-School, whatever that name of that group was, really thought this was a good idea, because there were more women going out. So but they really wanted quality care for their kids. It wasn't just dropping them somewhere. And also that whole issue about having your family do it, well, sometimes you didn't have family nearby, and sometimes you didn't sort of trust your family so much.
Yeah, sometimes they were unsuitable.
Educational aspect to it.
Right.
And so there was a broad support. So we weren't a minority. In general opinion, I think we were never a small minority. In general opinion, a lot of people supported the idea that whatever daycare there was, both infant and over, should be quality daycare. And it was very obvious that that was based upon the adult-child ratio. So that what I'm saying is that when you were talking about being consensual, I don't remember ever actually having to take a vote. And we didn't ever do anything.
I don't remember having to take
minority. It was because we were all on the same line. We were all on the same position, basically, in developing this struggle.
We did use Robert's rules in the bigger meetings just to keep order, but it was mainly managing a speakers list, not managing votes. So that was basically how that went. No, that's absolutely correct. The other thing is that this was a mix of parents and staff.
Mm-hmm.
And the parents were a mix. There were parents from nonprofits. There weren't a lot of parents from the old line charitable nonprofits, but there were parents from nonprofits, but there also were parents from municipal centers. Mm-hmm. I mean, Jessie, Anna Fraser, who I talked about, was one of Ed McKee's parents at Jesse Ketchum. So there were parents, which was always, it was helpful to have parents involved and not have this be seen as just something that was driven by, people who would lose their salaries or something like that. The other thing I'd like to mention is that we were fortunate with the media. And we were fortunate with the media in that a lot of people who were starting to work for some of the major outlets like the CBC, the Globe, the Star, places like that, were our age. And they were increasingly women, and some of them even had been involved in left-wing organizations when they were in university or such. And so they were predisposed to be helpful. And even some of the older line stuff, there was this sort of afternoon weekday program on CBC TV, which was like from 1 o'clock to 2:30 or something like that. It had this kind of avuncular male host who'd been around in CBC for eons. And I remember going there with Gene Woodsworth and the two of us, and I actually wore a dress for the occasion, maybe even a bra, I don't know. Yeah, right. And certainly pantyhose. Afterwards, he said to Jean, he said, "You two were so wonderful. I would certainly put my child in any child care you had anything to deal with." And I thought, well, this is
well done.
Yeah, right. That's right. That's right. Yeah.
So what did the government do about having put forward these proposals and then receiving all this negative response? I mean, you also had a demonstration in there somewhere, didn't you?
We had the biggest, what had been to date, the biggest demonstration in Toronto.
Wow.
Ever. It was about 2,000 people from all over the province.
Uh-huh.
Including children.
Yes,
yeah.
Including kids.
We made it a collective thing that wasn't just the adults who one just said, it said, this is for children, the children should be part of it. And they were. And they had balloons and blah, 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 but it was really, it came across in a very family positive way. And I think that was an important quality to that demonstration, besides good demands.
And what were the demands? Had you got the demands down to a manageable number at that point, or were you asking for the world?
Well, we wanted them to roll back the proposed changes, and we wanted more money for childcare.
Right.
And for Campus Community Cooperative, there was a real shift in that we had, as a center, we had been offside government for, I don't know, 5 years practically at that point, not quite that long. We certainly been offside the University of Toronto, but they didn't have anything to do with this. But we had been offside government because we were demanding that we needed to be able to choose our own staff no matter what. And at that point, most of the people on that steering committee were saying, look, we need qualified staff, for heaven's sake. You know, we can't cut down on the number of qualified staff. So we said, okay, fine. By that time, we had qualified staff and we were licensed anyway, so it was no skin off our nose. So we agreed to that. But yeah, I think the position was developed very, there was a lot of consensus. And I wish, I mean, you said that we put together a brief, which we did. Does anybody have a copy of the thing?
Yeah, it's actually on our website.
Oh, is it really? Oh my God. Who had that?
I don't remember. I got a lot of stuff, but since then, and I'm really sorry, I've only just come across this in the last few days. I have a brief from the Community Daycare Coalition of Metro Toronto, which Margaret Kidd gave me, and that's a bit different than the Daycare Reform Action Alliance.
That was the local organization.
Oh, I see. So you were all involved in this as well.
Yes, yeah.
Right.
Because that came along after Daycare Reform Action Alliance, I think. What's the date on it? Is there a date?
No. Oh, yes, October the 3rd, 74. You know,
Okay,
you wouldn't believe how many documents we have that aren't dated.
Right. I'm glad you've got them because I didn't keep any.
I'm sorry to hear that, Julie. I was hoping that we would get some from you. Anyway, and so involved in it was Mrs. Anna Thomas.
Oh, yes, right.
Mrs. Julia Schultz.
Oh, that's Julia Schultz, right?
Laura Rosenberg.
Oh, right. Okay. So Julia Schultz was, do you remember her?
No.
Oh, okay. She was very, very interesting. She's a Holocaust survivor.
Oh.
And okay. she had worked once she got out of the death camp. She had worked in displaced persons camps. Mm-hmm. And had landed, I think she'd lost her whole family in the camps, and somehow ended up in Toronto, and was volunteered on things like social planning council and on, you know, what would have been good causes, and she was extremely grounded. She was certainly more conservative than we were, but she was always very respectful, always extremely respectful. I respected her a lot, actually. Yeah. And Margaret was terrific, and Ev was terrific. I mean, yeah.
It's very sad we've lost a lot of the original organizers.
I mean, how many people are left? I mean, there's me and Susan. Anna Fraser died of pancreatic cancer, I found out. From her daughter. I got in touch with Deirdre. Well, the other thing is, I remember, Susan, I don't know what you remember about that summer, but I remember almost never being home. It was one thing or another, because one of the things that we tried to do was we tried to go to as many individual centers to parent meetings as would have us. And do you remember someone called Janet Day?
Yes, why do I remember that?
Pardon me?
And tell me who she was, because the name
she was a parent at Church of the Messiah Daycare. And she was a freelancer of one sort or another. And and Church of the Messiah was a nonprofit, not necessarily a co-op, but a nonprofit, and fairly newish. Good center, actually. She decided she wanted to make a video, which to show the difference between what would happen in a group of children with fewer staff. Yeah. So the staff at Church of the Messiah were really good. So they did a little video experiment, having, and the staff would point out, look, you know, we have fewer staff with that group now, and can't you see, look, those two are fighting over there, and this is happening, and that's happening, and video was in its total infancy at that point, and the video, you had to hook it up to a portable TV, and the video transmitter, not the recorder, but the transmitter that got the image to the TV weighed 500 pounds, I swear. And I can remember dragging that thing from center to center all that summer to show what would, and actually it wasn't a very good video. I mean, you really had to, you know, you really had to be able to sort of see the subtleties and anyway, but nevertheless, it was a propaganda effort.
Where is it? Do you know the video?
No, I don't have a clue.
Lost.
Yeah, gone.
No.
So but anyway, it wasn't only me doing this. I mean, it was the whole group, you know, just seizing whatever opportunity we could to get the word out. And I remember we had a telephone tree, and Ev organized the municipal centers to be the first geographic points in the telephone tree. So
what is a telephone tree, Julie?
A telephone tree is where you set it up so that the initial phoners have to make 10 phone calls at most, and then every person you phone makes another 5 phone calls, and each of those people make another 5 phone calls. So within an hour, you can get the message out to really a whole lot of people. So it was that kind of stuff. So we used it to remind people of big meetings and that kind of thing.
Right.
Organized for the demonstration. Yeah.
Yeah. So the demonstration, so how did the government respond to all of this pressure?
So their first tactic was to say nothing, and just carry on, and saying that this would make childcare less expensive for parents. They didn't mention it was going to make it less expensive for them too, but that they were putting money, you know, there's going to be extra funding for childcare based on these changes in regulation. So that's the political side. So we did have a meeting with Mrs. Birch, Minister Birch, we actually were very disciplined about the meeting. First of all, we showed up with 6 people, and she just about passed a plum. I mean, she was expecting two people who would sit across the table from her and listen. So we showed up with 6 of us, so they had to scurry around and get extra chairs, and you know, and she had this assistant who had pursed lips all the time. He was, and so anyway, so we had been very disciplined about the meeting. We were a delegation. Pat chaired the delegation actually, and everybody had Pat Schultz, and everybody had something that everybody had an issue that they were going to address. And so at one point, I know her EA broke in and said, I'd like to know about X, Y, Z. And I remember Pat turning and saying, actually, the next person's going to talk about that. And do you mind letting her finish what she's saying? So we marched in, had the meeting. They didn't have much of a response, marched out. And then a couple of other things happened. We started doing something that when I was political staff, and so probably when you were too, we really would have disapproved of, but we started showing up everywhere she spoke and making a fuss. And it got to the point where by kind of November, she just wasn't appearing in public anymore. We'd have little flying squads that go out to places where she was speaking. How we found out, you know how we found out about them? We found out about them through the NDP research office.
Oh yeah. Yeah.
So that was a help. They were the official opposition in that government, as you'll recall, newly actually. So we did that, and there was one that I remember in particular where where the province had organized a very hush-hush colloquium on choice. And the reason it was hush-hush is because they didn't want the right to life people showing up or the anti-choice people showing up. They actually wanted, Carol was invited and a whole bunch of the pro-choice. The Canadian,
the abortion laws.
yeah. So all those people were there, and we found out about it through a friend of Pat's who was on the executive of Carol. So we thought, okay, that's great. We'll trot into that. We managed to get in because of Marilyn Roycroft, because we showed up dressed like we were going to a colloquium. Pat was wearing a suit, like a skirt suit, which was, I said, oh my goodness, that's lovely. Where did you get it? She said, I wore it to my last wedding. That was when she married Kathy's dad, I think. So, and I was wearing, again, a dress and tights and stuff. And Marilyn flashed her badge saying leader of the opposition's office. And we just sort of scurried in behind her and got into the audience. We actually had brought a banner, and it was all folded up in an Eaton's bag that Pat had, so it looked like we'd been shopping at the break. And we sat across the aisle from each other, and at one point, as the minister was speaking, we got up, unfurled the banner, said, good childcare, lots of it. And at that point, the security guards hustled us out real fast, and they hustled the minister off the stage real fast. But that was so we did more of that kind of thing than they would have wanted us to do. But the funny part of it is, and Susan, I don't know if you remember, because I did talk about this in the steering committee. This wasn't a deep, dark secret, but we kept it within the steering committee. Was one night, and it probably would have been post the demonstration. It would have been sometime in the fall after the demonstration. At 11 o'clock at night, I got this call saying, is this Julie Mathian? And I said, yes. She said, Julie, this is Elsie Stapleford.
Oh.
And Elsie was the director of the childcare branch, or what was then the daycare branch at that point, and was the person who had refused to license Campus Community Cooperative. And so I said, oh, hello, Elsie, how are you? What is going on? She said, well, she said, Julie, I thought I'd just let you know what they're doing in there. and so what Elsie, I probably had 3 or 4 phone calls from Elsie during this moment, actually, where she basically, I mean, basically what she was saying is they don't know what to do about this. So that was good information. And so this was like, okay, fine, we'll keep up the pressure. Yeah. So, but that was, and Elsie lived to a great age. And I think, she would be one of the original authors of the Day Nurseries Act. She was one of the people who'd written it. And I think it just really stuck in her craw. And at that point, I'm not sure whether she had a position on profit versus nonprofit. I think she probably was an early feminist, just guessing. But she did not want those regulations changed.
Right.
And if she had to go underground to do it, she was risking her job.
Yeah.
Supposing we wrote an article about it in Good Daycare, which was our newsletter. I mean, supposing we said, news from inside or something like that, but we decided not to do that. Yeah.
Right. So what do you think the outcome then of your campaign was? A victory, or how would you characterize it?
What do you think?
I'm not going to answer. I'm going to let Susan go.
No, I remember that they withdrew part of it, but they withdrew the funding too, right?
Yeah, they did. Yeah, they did. They never went forward with the changes, but yeah, they were getting a lot of flack. I mean, there were people like Ann Barstow, who was at that point still, I think, on the board of Victoria Daycare Services, and was active in either the Ontario Welfare League or Social Planning Council. I can't remember which, and she was a pink Tory. And so, you know, the premier was getting phone calls from sort of the charitable wing of Toronto in particular, I think, and saying, you know, this is not sustainable. So, I mean, we had a partial victory, and then we saved the Nurseries Act, and we didn't get the increased funding. Because one of the things that it did do was put childcare on the map, and you did start to see an uptick, I think, in people who wanted to use licensed childcare, and it was it moved. It was slowly, but childcare. I do think we had a partial victory in terms of childcare quality, and having looked at childcare in other provinces, my God, that was worth saving.
Yeah.
It really was. I think we put childcare on the social policy map. Sue, if you've read my paper, you know, there were some beginnings of that at that point, but it wasn't as public an issue as it has become over time.
It was an excellent paper, Judy.
Oh, thanks. Yeah, and they set the stage. We set the stage for all of the other organizations that came after us. I mean, there have been ups and downs, but we've had a viable childcare movement in Toronto, or sorry, in Ontario for a very long time. And I think that it went from being a clutch of people to a very broad-based movement very, very quickly. And it kind of, there was obviously an appetite there for supporting this type of childcare. And it was very gratifying to see that.
Yeah.
So
basically, let me just comment the same thing, is that when you asked me what happened, I remember that the sense of we stopped something, but we didn't gain something. So we stopped this change in the ratios, but we didn't get more funding. We didn't get commitment for more funding. We didn't get the sort of thing that we wanted. You know, we didn't want just stopping this one little aspect. We wanted a lot more. But I think that Julie picked up on the really important part, is that because we were so public for that period of time, other people felt that they could speak up, and that gave a basis for a lot more people to come out and say, hey, I guess we have a right to this, as opposed to, yeah, I have to pay anything they charge.
Yeah, I'll pop the next door without Mini, or, you know, or whatever. The other thing is that we did start, it was part of, because we opposed commercial childcare, it gave us a base to really move forward on that and really promote nonprofit. And it was about a year and a half afterwards that the province started providing capital grants to nonprofit childcare centers, which they hadn't before. You had to either be a municipality or an Indian band to receive any kind of capital funding for childcare. So Devonshire was actually one of the first programs that got capital funds to renovate for childcare. That was what we sat in Simcoe Hall for Sussex. And so the U of T must have breathed a sigh of relief. In fact, I know they did at that point. So we were able to build on that. And I have to say that if things like that capital grants infrastructure hadn't been in place, it would have been a lot more difficult for us to have set up that network of nonprofit childcare centers and schools, which we were able to do in Toronto with a very helpful school board, and also people applying for capital grants for at the province, and actually applying for a capital grant for a school was actually a whole lot less expensive than applying for one for something else, because schools had a fair bit of appropriate infrastructure as it was, and so
right.
So yeah.
So another question I have for you is, what role did feminist activists play in this moment? And do you think that women activists actually identified themselves as feminists at this time? Susan, do you have thoughts about that?
I think feminists, I think both feminist activists played a central role because, for instance, Sussex was set up by the women from the University of Toronto Women's Movement, or whatever you want to call it. And then it just continued like that, so that I can remember when I started at Sussex, which I wasn't there at the beginning. Omar was a year old when I started bringing him down to Sussex, and the sense to which that continued to play a role. You're right to demand things. You're right, and that's the basic core of feminism: is your right to have demands, not to just accept what you were handed. And I think that played a central role. So that when we took over Devonshire and occupied it for, what was it, 6 months we had to occupy it before they gave us the right to be there without.
Yeah, right. Well, they never did, actually. They never did. We sat on various committees and they just basically gave up. Yeah, right.
But at the beginning, we were literally in the building 24/7, right?
Yeah.
And that was something that only came out of an activist. And clearly the core of that was the women's movement. So the whole requirement that if your child was in the campus community cooperative daycare centers, all the parents had to do shifts, even the fathers, even if it was after work. We had a very clear, and it was, so is that feminism? Yes, it is, whether it's important or not. I mean, you can make judgments about the political importance of all that, but I think the feminism and the idea of speaking up, and I think at the time, you didn't, whether you went around saying you were a feminist or not, you certainly were part of the women's movement, and they saw it as that. So later on, you learned to call yourself a feminist, and as a title or something like that. But being part of a broad movement that was changing things, was giving you a voice that had not been there before, and I think that was important.
So
and
what?
There were other feminists as well who weren't a part of our sphere, I guess. And I remember going to a meeting because there was a provincial, by that time, I think there was a Provincial Council of Women.
Yeah, Ontario.
Yeah, and
the Ontario Committee on the Status of Women.
Yes, yeah, yes, that's right. And as I recall, Laura Sabia was the chair of that. She was certainly, I don't know if she would have called herself a feminist. She certainly believed in equal rights for women, and she was a conservative. And she was very effective within the political culture of Ontario at that particular point, which had been conservative for, since Premier Drew, as I recall. Anyway, so she called a meeting in the middle of all of this to try and get the the Daycare Reform Action Alliance to back off. So so it was primarily to discuss the situation, but the idea was that we would back off. And when we said no, we're not going to, she was unhappy. She made her displeasure quite clear. But she had gathered a bunch of women, some of whom were actually sympathetic to us, but a bunch of women who were what I would guess call more mainstream. Not that we didn't have mainstream people as a part of this movement. We actually did have a lot of mainstream people as part of the movement. But these would have been different age and class cohort, partly.
Well, it does show the complexion of the emerging women's movement, doesn't it? With all of
it does. Yeah.
tendencies and emphasis and so on. Do you would you like to just describe Laura Sabia again?
She had a very strong presence. She actually, I think, within her circle was very effective. I expect she was pro-choice, for example. She would have been inclined to help the government out. She probably would not have had any problem with Mini-Skools running childcare in the province. And she certainly she probably thought we were kind of reds under the beds. I mean, which we actually were, but
Yeah.
but yeah. So she really was, and she was not used to being told thanks but no thanks.
Right.
Mhm.
So what do you think might be the most interesting aspects of this story for activists and researchers in the current period? Should I read that again? I mean, we're also trying to develop teaching resources for this that people can use on this using this website, which I think is going to be very relevant given everything's going online in the next several months. But I wonder if you have just a caption that you could say, could describe that what would be the most interesting thing about this story for archivists, for activists and researchers.
That's a good one. Let me just throw out one that strikes me in the context of today. Okay, with being part of the pandemic, and it does come from the feminist background that says you have a right to make your demands. And our demands were just rational. We didn't see them as asking for the moon and the stars and the sky above. We wanted good daycare because we needed to have jobs, or we wanted to get jobs. And so I can remember, the whole thing, you couldn't get daycare, the provincial daycare, you couldn't get the provincial daycare without having a job, and you couldn't get a job without having daycare. So it was, you were locked in, and you were getting, there was no way out without making demands. And I think that with all of what's going on now in terms of the healthcare and the frontline workers, the nurses, the people in the old folks home, which are in majority women, right? And they're saying, wait a minute, look at us, we are doing the central job, and you recognize it's a central job, but you're paying us less than minimum, not for, or less than that. And I think what I would want them to hear from us is that what you do is you speak up and you organize, and you've got a better chance of changing things than if you don't speak up and don't organize. Okay.
Right.
I would agree. I would agree 110%. I mean, I think my cut line would be organize, organize, organize. And back in the day, it was a lot of really, really, really hard work. I mean, a telephone tree is actually pretty primitive when it comes right down to it. We used to have things like our newsletter. We used to have professionally printed, but the rest of the stuff, it was Gestetner, for God's sake. I mean, yeah, right. And probably getting sick from the fumes. It was really great that we had daycare organizing committee as long as we had the funding. When LIP ended, actually, Company of Young Canadians picked us up for about a year because we in effect had two staff people. Mm-hmm. We had me and Susan as long as we were both working there. And so that was a real help, but that was more coincidence than anything else. Yeah. So yeah. And ally yourself with like-minded people who can help.
Yeah, and it wasn't a problem getting the funding from the federal government under LIP. It wasn't a problem that you were activists and you were organizing against the provincial government. None of that mattered. Eh?
No. When we got the original funding, what the original funding was for was to set up nonprofit childcare centers in places where they didn't have them in Toronto. Yeah. So that was, but it was, 12 Sussex was a really political place. So of course it was political, right? Yeah. And became political pretty soon. And so we were and we started doing seminars like that Saturday morning seminar I described. We started to do things like how to start your own daycare, which was really, it's hard now. It was really hard back then.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. We're about at the end, and I would like to finish up by asking you two individually what this meant for your, how your involvement in this moment, what it meant for your future activism in the women's movement. Were you involved in other organizations or other, just how did you move on from this moment?
Can I start on this one, Julie? Or you
Yeah,
want
I
to-
was waiting for you to do that. Yes, right.
It changed everything for me. It's really funny, is that I had come, I'm originally from the States, had come to Canada in February of 71 as the partner to a draft dodger for against the US war in Vietnam. Okay. And it was I started getting involved with the daycare center with Sussex that fall, like 6 months later. And there I met all these feminists and all these progressive people. And so when the daycare organizing committee got set up, the other person was Jackie Larkin, right? And Jackie, as you know, was already part
Don't
of.
forget Graham. Don't forget Graham.
Yeah. Oh yes.
Yeah.
So I can remember that Jackie, who was already to the left at that time, saying to me, "Okay, why don't you read Karl Marx's 18th Brumaire?" And I go, "Okay." I got about 3 pages in it, and I thought, I don't know enough history of France to be able to say whether he's right or wrong. And so she said, well, why don't you read Ernest Mandel's Marxist Economic Theory? And she loaned me the book. And I returned it to her on the following Monday. And I said, I read it. It's very good. I agree. And she says, I'm still on chapter 1. All right. So that, and that sort of repositioning how you thought about things and then being involved politically in what was, if not a mass movement, a pretty mass movement. A lot of it, there were divisions within the women's movement and all that. Really did change. It became a norm for me. So that I moved here to Quebec in '76, and here in Quebec, I've maintained. I was in a political group in Toronto that was called the Revolutionary Marxist Group. And then when I moved to Quebec, I became a member of its sister organization called the Groupe Marxiste Revolutionnaire. And I have been part of that since then in all of its different forms. And then I became, when I started teaching here at the CEGEP system, I was of course involved with the unions. And that women's movement had a very powerful movement, an impact in the political situation in Quebec in the late 70s and early 80s. And so, you know, the extension of daycare, the demands for daycare, the demands for equal speaking rights, all of that became just part. So both in my job, because I was on the union executive, of course, and in my political life, it's just flowed from there. And since then, the political group itself has had various formations and comes and goings, but I've been involved on that political framework, both at the level of Quebec and at the pan-Canadian level and at an international level. So it really started me on something that I feel grounded me for my life.
Thank you. How about you, Julie?
Well, I go back a bit to, as well as Susan did, because the beginning of that sort of change was when I was in on the Simcoe Hall occupation to get money to originally renovate 12 Sussex for childcare, because I was at art college at the time. We were having a reading week, and Tom came in and said, Tom was he wasn't on SAC at that point, but he was later on, and he was a member of the New Left Caucus at U of T, and he said, there's a big demo over at Simcoe. They've occupied Simcoe Hall. I'm going over. Why don't you come? And I said, sure, why not? I'd always, I'd worked as a camp counselor and, done all the kid-related things that a teenager could do. At that time, I was 20, but that a teenager could do. And I worked for the Parks Department in the summer. I liked kids, and I liked being with kids. I was interested in kids. And so I thought, well, childcare seems like a good thing to do with kids. My dad had died when he was 43 and I was 14. And my mother at that point had scandalized our North Toronto neighborhood by working part-time. And immediately started to work full-time after that. And I'm the eldest of 4. So, I knew what the life of a working mom was like. I had no idea that millions of working class moms did the same thing. But I came to that knowledge fairly soon after that. But anyway, so I found myself after graduation. I had decided about in the last year that I was training to be a silversmith. That wasn't what I was going to be. So I was sort of trying to figure out what to do with the rest of my life. And 12 Sussex needed volunteers, so I started volunteering there. And really, they were really happy to have someone show up on a regular basis who liked kids. I mean, they really were. And so I started volunteering there, and this became a part of that community. And that for me was I'd known about and attended a couple of meetings of the on-campus feminist groups. And for me, that was really hands-on and applied, and really appealed to me for that reason. And so the kind of fight that we had with both the University of Toronto and the province, and that I started volunteering the spring of 1969. So
Wow.
maybe the spring of 1970. Anyway, Campus Community Cooperative was less than a year old at that point, so it was pretty new. But already and they just finished the renovations. But we were still fighting. We still had refused to hire qualified staff. So we were still fighting the province. We were still fighting the university to stay in our space and get more. And so all of that kind of negotiations and basically standing our ground kind of was helpful to me in terms of the next fight with the province, which was the Birch proposals. And in terms of the organizing, we just did what we had to do. Essentially, we really did. But it was very helpful to me to meet a really broad spectrum of the childcare community and become acquainted with people that I respected all of my life, and people I'm always happy to see. And it was and then I went on to I spent, what did I do? I spent a year working for the nonprofit housing network in Toronto. I find housing policy eye-glazing, by the way, but I did that. And then by 1975, I'd started to work for the school board, organizing nonprofit childcares in. At that point there was surplus school space. There still is. And the Toronto board, which is a very progressive school board, had developed a whole policy and funding thing for putting nonprofit organizations in school space, and childcare was the most sensible one to put in. So.
And how about organizations, political organizations or women's organizations? Did you later participate in any of those?
No, I didn't. And I was involved in some of the other childcare organizations as well, because we were at the same meetings earlier on, I would say in the late 70s, early 80s probably. And I was on various childcare organizations, like I was one of the first members of the Metro Daycare Advisory Committee. So it was our municipal advisory committee that we browbeat the municipality into having. I was on the things like on the board of Social Planning Council. I sat on other nonprofit boards, Polito Canada, for example. I mean, so I did more of that kind of thing. Then I was, I've been a member of the NDP for years, except that I've never been on my writing committee executive or anything like that. I mean, I've always helped out in campaigns and that's been it. So yeah, no, I haven't.
Yeah. Great.
Yeah, I wasn't involved in NAC. I mean, people like Martha were involved in NAC. I supported NAC, thought NAC was a great organization, but yeah. Oh, and I was also on, remember what was the federal what was the federal,
The Child Care Advocacy Association.
yes, right. I was on the CC. I was one of the Ontario reps on the CCAC. So,
Yes, that's right.
Yeah.
Yeah. Great. Well, thank you both. Fantastic. It's been
Yeah.
so fun.
yeah.
Thanks a lot. This is a lot of fun.
Well, actually,
And
the
I hope
questions were,